So by the end of the 1890s, films were starting to become a household name. Now almost all people, if they were bored and wanted some form of entertainment, a movie theater was the way to go. The 1900s would be the decade where we start to see more and more movie theaters, new people who were still getting used to films, and were also starting to expand more on directors, editors, actors, and other stuff. Films were also seen in other places too, like amusement arcades, music halls, traveling fairs, etc., etc. Now, although films and movies were getting more recognizable, the problem was the audience and the movies themselves. The people were starting to become sick of movies just being a daily life scene, with movies that are just simply someone feeding a baby or watering a garden, or just a simple magic act. They were sick of it, and they were also sick of films just being used for news broadcasting. They wanted a film that was not only new, but something that just wasn't a thing you can easily do in real life. They wanted some fantasy into it, and that's what people like George Méliès realized, which is why some of his films, like The Haunted Castle or Cinderella, was a hit, because it was fantasy. It was something that doesn't happen in real life. So by the beginning of the 1900s, we start to see some films that were new, and it wasn't just a daily life type stuff, and we'll be seeing a lot more of those in this decade. The Enchanted Drawing. I guess you can call this an animation movie, even though it's not really animated, it's more just like stop motion mixed with live action, but this was an innovative film at the time. It stars and directed by James Stewart Flaxton. The whole plot of this movie is that it's James drawing some pictures and then pulls the pictures out and they become real life, like a wine glass and bottle and a hat and cigarette. This was more like an experiment for James because he started off with stop motion. This was like the first time he ever combined a hand picture drawing with a live action person. I wonder if this would be helpful in another film. And now we get to talk about one of the most important films in history. This film really took imagination, story, actors, and everything else to a whole new level. And this is still a film, and it's very interesting to watch. That is A Trip to the Moon, or for you French people out there, Le Forest dans la Lune. This was a film that changed everything. This was the film that blew everybody's mind. This was the film that audience was looking for, and they loved and praised the hell out of this movie when it came out. Actually, there's still some people praising the hell out of this movie, and for good reasons. It is a very good and innovative film. A Trip to the Moon was the first film that was new and was different than all the other films we have seen. This was technically the first sci-fi. This was the first film to be longer than 10 minutes. And this was the first film to have a big production and budget. The plot of the movie is that it's a bunch of group of magicians going to the moon for the first time. So they organize a rocket and get shot out of a cannon into the moon. And they come across some moon people, and now they must get back to Earth. The film was inspired from a book called From Earth to the Moon, written by Julius Beers in 1865, and it's basically sort of the same plot. However, the book was set after the Civil War, where in the film it just basically starts at a Merlin convention. This was the hardest and longest film that George has ever worked on. It's 14 minutes long, and they had lots of scenes they had to make and shoot, as well as they had a lot more people involved than his earlier work. The film cost about $10,000 in French, and took 3 months to complete. That's about as long as it took Walt Disney to make Dumbo. Miles had hired actors that he had many connections with and were paid with French coins per day. Now the reason the film cost so much money was mostly due to the mechanically operated scenery and the silly costumes, which were made from cardboard and canvas. There was also lots of special effects for this movie, some which Miles had already done, like the stop trick and tracking shots. There was also a hand-colored version of this film, and it was the first film to have a poster, and it was also the first movie that has become famous because of one very special moment, and that's the one where the rocket in the moon hits the eye. That becomes a sign for moviegoers. So after the filming, the film was released on September 1st, 1902, in French, and then a few months later in the rest of the world. And this was the boom year for films like this. This film met with both critical praise and made lots of money. Although George himself also likes the film and acknowledged it as a masterpiece, he says it's not one of his best works, but it did make lots of people happy, and later today is known as one of the greatest films of all time, and it was ranked at 84 on the top 100 films of all time. The Great Train Robbery. Ever wanted to know where the train robbery theme began? Well, here's your movie. The Great Train Robbery was another popular film to come out of the 1900s. It's about a group of thieves robbing a train. It's considered to be an early Western film, and much like A Trip to the Moon, it had a big budget of about $150. I know that may not seem much in today's standards, but again, back in my day. Now, the main difference between this and A Trip to the Moon is that in this film they use real sets and locations, like they use a real train, a real railroad, and a real forest. This is also the first American movie to have a title screen at the beginning. There were also some actors that would later become well known, especially one guy that pointed a gun at the screen in the end of the film. In fact, some audience believed that they were going to be shot. There was even a point where the sheriff pointed a gun at the screen, believing and started shooting the actor. How would you like to be in that movie theater? The film did well when it first came out. It received some good reviews, and it was considered the biggest blockbuster movie at the time, until another film came and stole the title, but we'll get to that another time. Okay, so at this point, this is where we're going to dive into something really controversial in movies that have to deal with African Americans. So if you're the type of person that gets uncomfortable and offended, then I'll put a link down to where you can skip this part. So before we get to the next film, let us at least dive into some American history first. So most of you would have known that in 1619 is the year when African people first came to America, and they were basically used as slaves. And this would later become hell for African people. They were treated very badly and very poorly. They did try to at least give them some rights after the Civil War, and some were granted equal rights, but others did not, and some slave owners didn't like the idea. But eventually, they did ban slavery. So now they were just like, okay, we'll force them to be in plays, or treat them like shit in plays. So you will have, white people dressing up as African Americans, which is known both as like blackface and the minstrel show. You would see in some African people, but very little, and when they would mostly portray them as the dumbest person you would meet, like playing the banjo, doing stupid stuff, and talking real stupid, and most white people loved it. So in 1903, we get the first film that uses blackface and portrays African Americans in Uncle Tom's Cabin. The Uncle Tom's Cabin was based on a novel by the same name, which was honestly written by a white woman who was against slavery. Now, the novel was about a man named Uncle Tom who was sold to a slave master, and it follows Tom's story on how slavery life was like for him. The whole purpose of the novel was to show people why slavery was wrong, and because this was during the Civil War, you can imagine how people's reaction was to this book. However, even though the book was meant to be an anti-slavery novel, the people saw this as a way to stereotype African Americans. And now we've got characters that we all seen before, like the Picanati, the stereotypes of black children, and Uncle Tom is more written as a person who was loyal to his white master. The film tries to capture the original novel, but it doesn't really work here, because one is white people in blackface. Plus, if you never read the novel like me, you would most likely be confused on what this movie is trying to be. Like, you don't know if it's trying to be racist or if it's trying to teach the bad stuff about slavery. Like I said, the film's not very clear on that. I mean, you could say maybe it's an anti-slavery film based on like how they show you the plantation, or you might call it racist by the blackface makeup. Honestly, especially the films that we'll get later that portrays African Americans, this one's a bit more tame in comparison. I mean, they don't go too far with the blackface jokes or anything. I think it's just more on a film based on, Tom's life. So if you are a little curious, or if you have read the novel, I say it's at least one watch. That they did make more Uncle Tom movies in the silent era until 1927, and then they just stopped after that. Now, let's take a look at some film facts of the 1900s. With electricity invented in 1901, we got the first electric movie theater in 1902, called Thomas Telly's Electric Theater. But in 1901, the Black Mirror was the first movie theater studio to be closed and was destroyed 2 years later. 1903 is when Hollywood was officially incorporated as a business. Loews Theaters would become the longest-living theater chain in America. 1904 is the year when the Warner Brothers first came into the film business. They first made a company called the Bequeathed Amusement Supply Company. It was used to distribute some films. And then in 1905, they opened their first Nickelodeon, no, not the channel, a theater, and it would house 99 people and charge 5 cents for 3 movies. That'll do for film facts. Let's continue to 1906. Okay, so in 1892, we got our first ever animation film, which was Pave Parrot, directed by Raymond. And then in the 1900s, we got a mix between animation and live action with the Enchanted Drawing. But then in 1906, we returned to another animation film called Humorous Faces of Funny Faces, directed in 1906 by James Blackton. You know, the same guy that directed the Enchanted Drawing. Now, unlike the Enchanted Drawing, this film is fully animated, but what's interesting about this animation is that this might be the first and only time where the animation is made from chalk. And really, the whole animation is on a chalkboard. So, you can make the argument that this is also a stop motion as well. The film is 3 minutes long, and it's just Blackton doing what he can do with animation. There's a part where a clown has a hoop and a dog jumps over it. To me, this is what I think of animation, is that people doing what they can do with animation. And James really has the imagination and creativity with this short. Even the title sequence looks very creative. It's a great film to start the animation era, and I can only imagine what people's first thought was when they first saw it on film. If you have not seen this film yet, do yourself a favor and watch it. The Story of the Kelly Gang. This was the first ever full-length film, about 70 minutes long, and it premiered in Malibu, Australia on December 26, 1906. This was one of the longest films to ever come out during the silent era. It had a budget between £400 and £1,000, and it took 6 months to make. The film includes the director's family, and it tells a story about Kelly and his gang trying to get away from the law and starts killing people. The film didn't do so hot when it first came out. Most audience thought that the film was praising criminals and gangs, so it ended up being banned in some cities in Australia from 1907. Then in 1912, there were some other films that were banned across Victoria. However, despite the film being banned, it was shown in other places like Ireland and Berlin, and it was rediscovered, but only bits and pieces of it were survived. So if you're looking for this movie, most likely you'll find the 20-minute version. So until they release the full version, this is what you'll have to watch if you want to see it. However, this wasn't the only full-length film. There was another one released in 1907 called The Prologed Sun. This one is 90 minutes. However, the bad news is that I can't find any other information on this film. I don't know who stars in it, I don't know what was the budget, I can't even find the film itself. So if anyone does find the film, someone please let me know, and I might check it out in the meantime. Now, here are some other films of the 1900s. Sherlock Holmes Battle, the first movie based on the Sherlock Holmes book. Fire, the first film to combine an indoor set with an outdoor set. Fun in a Bakery Shop, stop motion mixed with object manipulation. The Impossible Voyage, a remake or sequel to George Méliès' A Trip to the Moon. The Little Train Robbery, the first ever parody of a movie made by the same director of The Great Train Robbery. However, the twist is that it's kids instead of adults. And Rescued by Rover, the first film where the star is a dog. And that's the other films of the 1900s. Now let's get back to our regular timeline. Time for some more animation. This time we're going back to France again with Fantomascope, released on August 17, 1908. This was the second 2D animated cartoon, the first one being again the paper period. But much like humorous faces or funny faces, this is another example of what you can do with a drawing versus what you can do in a motion pictures. There are a lot more creative scenes, and again, there's a bit of mix of live action, but it's mostly 2D animations. The director, Emile Cold, had drawn each film on paper. Then he would shoot each frame into a negative film, and there were a total of 700 drawings for the film. It's under 2 minutes, and it may borrow some tricks from George, like the stop-motion trick. Okay, so most of the films that I've talked about all have one thing in common. They have no sound or music. Back then, most music was performed live while the movie was playing. But now in 1908, we finally get a movie that has an original score composed by Camille Saint. And not only that, but we also get our first screenplay by an eminent screenwriter. The assassination of the Duke of Guise was another one of those important and interesting films for both France and America. The movie has a more elaborate narrative techniques, and it was another one of those films that had some stuff that was a bit new at the time. The film came out on November 17, 1908 in France, then a few months later in February 17, 1909 in America. The film did well in France, and it inspired other companies to make more elaborate films. In America, it wasn't a big bomb, but it wasn't as successful in France. It did well with the upper-class America, but the average ones might not get the plot, but it still did well enough, for most people actually did like it. And now here's some more film facts of the 1900s. Chicago's White Front Theater opens in 1906, and from 1906 to 1908, there were about 5,000 Nickelodeons around the U.S. 1907 is when filmmakers moved to Los Angeles, realizing that it has the perfect climate and a variety of natural scenery. Variety published the first ever reviews on January 19, 1907. The two films they reviewed is An Exciting Honeymoon and The Life of a Cowboy. We even get another film review from the New York Times in 1909. This is also the year where the New York Times coined the word stars. To wrap this up, let's look at some more films from the 1900s. The Paymaster, known for his creative use of light. Rescue from an Eagle's Nest marks the debut of actor and later film director D.W. Griffith. The Girl and the Outlaw marks the first ever movie star Florence Lawrence. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the first real horror film. The Nick Carter series was the first detective films. And here with arguably the first independent film under the name of a new company, Carl Luminous Independent Moving Picture Company. Well, that about does it for the first series of film history. I hope you learned something new for this. Maybe you might see some of these films I've mentioned. And I actually do hope you see some of these films, because I think they're pretty good and interesting films themselves. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next year, where we'll take a look at the 1910s films. Till then, this is Recorder Diesel, and I'll see you all later. Take care, everybody.